They said she was me. They walked her into that office with my name trembling in her mouth like a word she'd stolen, and when the notary asked her to repeat her birth date, she hesitated. My own daughter had paid a stranger to become me for an hour. That's how little my face mattered to her, how easily she believed I could be replaced. And no, we didn't look anything alike. That part still makes me laugh in a way that isn't laughter at all, more like a crack in the ceiling spreading quietly above your head while you pretend everything is fine. I was in my kitchen when it happened, sitting at the small table I've had since my 30s, the one with a dent near the edge from where my husband once dropped a frozen roast. I was slicing apples for a pie I wasn't even sure anyone would eat. These days I bake out of habit, not anticipation. The phone vibrated on the table, not ringing, vibrating, like it was trying not to disturb me, and maybe that was a warning I didn't understand. I answered because the number was local, and local numbers still feel polite to me, less dangerous than blocked ones. The man introduced himself too formally, too carefully, as if his voice stepped on the floorboards before he did. He said he was calling from a notary office across town and wanted to confirm something regarding your presence. My presence. Such a strange phrase. I remember wiping my hands on my apron and pressing the phone harder to my ear because something in my chest tightened, not in fear. Fear comes later, but in recognition, like when you suddenly recall the shape of a room you haven't entered in decades. I told him plainly that I was at home, that I hadn't scheduled any appointment with a notary. He went quiet in a way that told me he expected that answer and dreaded it at the same time. And that was the first moment I understood something irrevocable had happened without my permission. He said very gently that a woman had arrived claiming to be me, that she'd brought documents with my name on them, and that she was trying to sign over my house, to someone else. For a few seconds I heard nothing but the soft hum of the refrigerator, the slice of air through the cracked window over the sink, the faint rustling of a sparrow trapped between the branches of the lemon tree outside. Then he asked if I could come immediately. I could hear urgency stitched into his politeness, like he didn't want to alarm me, but the situation had already outrun courtesy. I remember looking around my kitchen the way one looks around a train compartment, just before a sudden stop, checking if everything was still where I'd left it. The apron, the apples, the pie dish, the half-read newspaper by the kettle, my small universe intact, unbothered, as if betrayal required a stage grander than my plain old kitchen. I told him I would come right away. I didn't grab my purse at first. I grabbed the back of the chair, steadying myself because something inside me had shifted, and I needed a second to feel the floor again. Walking to the door felt like walking underwater. You always think a betrayal like this will burst into your life with noise and chaos, but it doesn't. It steps in lightly through the side door, wearing your daughter's perfume. Outside the street was quiet, almost offensively ordinary, the neighbors watering their plants, a dog barking behind a fence, a package left on someone's doorstep, and there I was, 80 years old, locking the door of a house someone else had tried to steal out from under me while I was peeling apples. My house. The house my husband and I bought with every scraped-together dollar. The house where I buried 2 dogs under the camellia bush. The house where my daughter once slept on my chest because she wouldn't go to her crib. The house I kept even after my husband died because I didn't know how to live anywhere else. I got into my car, the one my daughter said was too old to be safe, and turned the key. My hands shook, not from panic, but from a deep, anchored disbelief that someone who had once cried in my arms had orchestrated something so cold, so methodical. When I reached the notary office, 2 police cars were already there, lights off but present in that way cops are present, quiet as a held breath. The notary met me at the door. He looked relieved and unsettled at the same time, like he was standing in two different truths, and neither one made sense. He ushered me in and pointed toward a small waiting area where a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at me the way someone looks at a photograph they hoped would remain imaginary. She wasn't old enough, not by a decade. Her hair was too dark, her posture too confident, but she wore a scarf around her neck like the one my daughter gave me 3 birthdays ago, and that alone made my stomach turn. The police asked me simple questions: my name, my address, my identification. I answered without trembling. The woman, my replacement, said nothing. She avoided my eyes, and I couldn't tell if she felt shame or simply regret that she'd been caught. When they asked her who hired her, she refused to speak, but I didn't need her answer. I knew. I knew the way you know when rain is coming even before the clouds gather. I stood there watching them take her away and felt something inside me close. Not a door, but a chapter, something soft that had been bruised too many times. And I thought, so this is what it has come to. Not arguments, not tears, not misunderstandings. No, my daughter went straight to erasing me from my own life. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't fall. I just breathed slowly, deeply, like a woman finally waking from a long dream in which she kept excusing the people who hurt her the most. That was the beginning. Not of the crime, not of the investigation, not of the unraveling that followed. No, it was the beginning of me seeing my daughter clearly for the first time in decades, stripped of the illusions I had wrapped her in. And it was the beginning of me remembering that I am not a ghost in my own story, not a name on a deed someone can swap like a faulty battery. I left that office an older woman, yes, but not a weak one. If anything, I walked out stronger than I'd walked in, because I finally understood the truth. I had been replaced long before that woman ever walked into the notary's office pretending to be me. The funny thing about a catastrophe, if you can call it funny, is that while it is happening, you keep trying to fold it into something you already know. You try to tell yourself, this is just a misunderstanding, an exaggeration, a bad joke, stretched too far, because the alternative is to admit that someone you love set fire to the floor under your own feet and then complained about the smoke. After the woman who wore my name like a stolen coat was led away, the notary suggested I sit down, and his voice had that careful softness people use for the newly bereaved or the obviously fragile. Except in that moment, I did not feel fragile. I felt like glass that had finally cooled and hardened after years of being reheated and reshaped for everyone else's comfort. He slid a glass of water toward me and asked if I wanted to call someone, perhaps a relative, perhaps the daughter whose name, he admitted, had already been mentioned. And I remembered the precise way his eyes flicked to the side as he said it, as if he was preparing for me to fall apart. I told him I wanted him to tell me everything in order, without skipping the parts that would make him uncomfortable, and that if I felt like calling my daughter, I would do it myself when I knew what I was calling her about. So he did. He walked me through the morning like he was reading from a report, but his hands betrayed him, fingers worrying the edge of his notepad, tapping his pen against the table when he reached the parts that felt wrong, even to a man who sees. People sign things all day for a living. He said a younger woman had come first, stylish, tense, the kind of person who fills a room with her urgency. And I knew before he said it that this was my daughter, because I have watched her enter rooms like that since she was 15, full of the conviction that the world is always a few steps behind her and must hurry to catch up. She had introduced herself as my representative, he said, and explained that I was too frail to manage the trip, but insisted on getting our affairs in order. And he repeated those phrases with a practiced neutrality that could not hide his distaste. She told him I wanted to transfer the house to her name, while I was still lucid enough to consent. And those words landed between us like something rotten, the suggestion that my mind was a candle, burning down to its last flicker, that any delay might leave her trapped in the dark with a mother who no longer recognized her own signature. He had asked, quite reasonably, why I was not present if I was competent to sign, and my daughter, he said, had smiled that strained, patient smile he recognized from other adult children trying to move elderly parents around like pieces of furniture, and she said that I was anxious around offices, that I had mobility issues, that it was hard on me to leave the house for long. He had insisted, still calmly, that for a transfer of property of that magnitude, the person signing needed to be physically present unless there was a clear, legally established power of attorney. And she had pulled out a folder, thick with papers, and set it on the table with a little flourish, like a magician revealing the final card. Inside, he said, were copies of my ID, older ones mixed with newer, a shaky-looking letter supposedly from me granting her the right to handle my estate decisions, and a stack of medical notes, selective and vague, printed from some portal he suspected she had access to, each one highlighting my age, my blood pressure, my minor forgetfulness about a prescription dose from years ago. Nothing that proved incompetence, but enough to build a story if someone wasn't paying attention. He told me he had felt a small alarm ring in the back of his mind even then, not because such situations never occurred, but because something about the way she spoke of me was wrong. She was careful, yes, and polite, but when she mentioned me, it was as if I were a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected. And in his line of work, that tone often pointed toward trouble. When he insisted again that I would need to be present, she did not argue. She simply said that, of course, that had been the plan all along, and that I was on my way with a home care aide. She asked for a little time, stepped outside to make calls, paced the sidewalk, came back twice to check how much longer he would be available, and then, almost an hour later, the other woman arrived, the one the police would later escort away, the one who sat stiffly in that plastic chair and refused to look at me when I walked in. He said that when the second woman entered, his first reaction was not suspicion, because he had seen age shrink people in uneven ways. He had seen weight lost and hair dyed and faces altered by illness or resolve, and he had learned not to trust his eyes alone. She handed over an ID with my name on it, a poorly laminated imitation of the real thing, and if he had not seen my genuine ID a year earlier when I had updated another document with him, perhaps he would not have hesitated. She answered his first questions correctly, my full name, my address, the year my husband died, all things my daughter would know and could feed to an accomplice. But then he asked, out of habit, about my surgery 2 years ago, the one I had, complained about in his office while he made copies, the one on my hip that left me leaning heavily on my cane for months. And he realized, as he spoke, that this woman had walked in unaided, a little stiff perhaps, but without the particular guarded shuffle of someone whose hip had been opened and closed like a door. When he asked her to confirm the date, she faltered just a fraction of a second, then said she couldn't remember everything that happened at my age, and that sentence, he told me, snapped everything into place. The real woman who had sat in that chair a year ago had recited her surgery date with the precise annoyance of someone who had counted every day of recovery. And he suddenly knew he was looking not at an old woman slipping away, but at an actor with a bad script. That was when he stepped out, under the pretense of checking a reference, and called the number that had been attached to my file since my husband and I first came to him decades ago. The number I had never changed even when my daughter told me to. Update to something more convenient. I picture him standing in that narrow hallway with the phone pressed to his ear while my daughter waited outside and my imitator sat at his desk, hands folded, while my kitchen clock ticked gently over the sink and my knife moved through apple flesh. And I think how thin the wall was between my ordinary morning and the moment the world decided I needed to wake up. When he reached me and heard my confusion, he knew it was fraud, not misunderstanding. And that was when he called the police quietly, giving them just enough information to arrive without sirens. By the time I got there, they had already separated my stand-in from my daughter. My daughter was apparently in the parking lot, pacing and gesturing into her phone, pretending, he suspected, to be the concerned child dealing heroically with her. Difficult mother. I asked where she was, my voice so even I surprised myself, and he said the officers had asked her to come inside to clarify her involvement. But she had become flustered and said she needed to pick up her own kids from school, promised to return with me, then driven off. That, more than anything, fixed the reality in place. When her theater fell apart, she did not rush in to apologize, to explain, to break down. She fled, leaving a woman she had paid to impersonate me to face the consequences alone, leaving the mess. As she had always left dishes in my sink, confident that someone else would clean it up. The officers asked if I wanted to press charges against the impersonator, and I looked at that woman, who still would not meet my eyes, and I felt a strange mixture of anger and pity, because yes, she had used my name and tried to steal my home, but she had also, I suspected, believed whatever story she had been sold about an old woman who had agreed to let her daughter handle everything. I told them I wanted a full report on record and that I wanted my daughter's name included wherever it legally belonged, that I did not want this to disappear into a drawer as one more unfortunate incident blamed on confusion. They nodded, perhaps surprised by my clarity, and one of them admitted almost reluctantly that cases like this were becoming more common, that adult children sometimes did desperate things when houses and inheritances were involved. I told him calmly that desperation is what you feel when you cannot feed your children, not when you are impatient to take over a house you did not buy, and he did not argue. On the drive home, I kept waiting for the wave of hysteria I had always been told would come with a shock like this, the trembling, the sobbing against the steering wheel, the dramatic pullover to the side of the road, but none of that happened. Instead, a long, slow reel of memory played behind my eyes. The first time my daughter asked me casually if I had ever thought about putting the house in her name early, the day she showed me a stack of forms and said they were just routine. Medical permissions, the way she insisted I leave my important documents at her place for safekeeping after my husband died, 1,000 small red flags I had folded neatly and tucked into a drawer, labeled, "She means well, she's just overwhelmed." By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was sliding down behind the neighbor's roof, and the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Its front steps patiently waiting, the hydrangeas by the gate nodding in the breeze, the curtains drawn just so, but I saw it differently now. It wasn't just a building I lived in. It was a line someone had tried to cross, a boundary I had let blur for too long. I turned off the car, sat there with my hands on the wheel, and let the truth settle. My daughter had not simply made a bad choice under pressure. She had planned, coordinated, calculated, and executed an attempt to erase me while my heart was still beating in my own chest. And yet, beneath the sharpness of that realization, there was something else, quieter and more dangerous. A small, stubborn voice asking what I had done over the years to teach her that I was removable. I wish I could say that after the notary's call and the police report and the long ride home with my hands gripping the steering wheel as if I were holding on to the last piece of a life that had just tried to slip out from under me. Everything immediately turned sharp and clear and actionable. But the truth is that the next few days unfolded with a strange, quiet heaviness, as if the world itself were trying to convince me that nothing catastrophic had happened, that my kitchen was still my kitchen, that the apples on the counter still needed peeling, that the mail still needed sorting, and that the betrayal lodged under my ribs was just a misunderstanding waiting to be gently corrected by a single honest conversation. The human heart, especially the heart of a mother, always tries to rewrite violence into confusion. It is a terrible habit, one that women of my generation were trained in from girlhood, told that if we simply waited, softened, soothed, or compromised, the people we loved would circle back to the truth and claim us again. So for 2 days, I moved through the rooms of my house like someone reacquainting herself with a space she had lived in for decades, but now saw through a stranger's eyes. Every picture frame, every dent in the baseboard, every mug my husband bought me at some forgettable roadside diner held a new kind of fragility, as if the objects themselves understood they had nearly been reassigned to another woman's life story, packed into boxes under someone else's supervision, labeled and sorted according to my daughter's sense of efficiency. I cleaned more than necessary, wiping surfaces that didn't need wiping, reorganizing the pantry as if the order of the cans could restore order to my thoughts, and I caught myself pausing in doorways the way one does after a funeral, listening to the familiar rooms, trying to detect what had changed inside me that made the house feel simultaneously too large and too small. It didn't take long for the first message from my daughter to arrive, and when it did, it came not as a phone call with the urgent contrition a decent person might offer, but as a brief, clipped text that read like a memo from a woman addressing a colleague she barely respected. "Mom, there's been a misunderstanding. We should talk when you're feeling calm." I stared at those words until they blurred, because in them was every subtle humiliation I had swallowed over the years. Every moment she had dismissed my worries as dramatics. Every conversation in which she had corrected my memory as though she were the curator of my mind. Calm. I had been calm when the notary called. I had been calm when the police questioned me. I had been calm while driving home with my heartbeat thudding like a metronome in my throat. Calm was not the problem. Truth was the problem. She followed the text with another, a longer one, full of the kind of careful, conciliatory phrasing she had learned from corporate HR seminars, language designed to soothe while simultaneously assigning blame. "I think things may have gotten blown out of proportion. The woman who came with me wasn't impersonating you. She was helping navigate paperwork. This is a very common arrangement for elderly parents, and I think the notary panicked." It was almost elegant, the way she managed to rewrite an attempted felony into a clerical misunderstanding. And for a moment, an embarrassingly brief moment, I felt that old tug inside me, the one that wanted to believe her, to reach for the easiest explanation, to forgive first and ask questions never. Because questioning a child feels like questioning the very meaning of your own motherhood. But then I remembered the look on the notary's face, the hesitation in the imposter's voice, the folder of documents doctored with such carelessness, and the way my daughter had fled the scene rather than face me. The truth stood up inside me like a spine, straightening after a long stoop, and I put the phone down without responding. Over the next days, the pressure increased, not through dramatic confrontations or shouted accusations, but through a series of small, invasive gestures that revealed just how long my daughter had been testing the boundaries of my life. She left voicemails that began warmly, but ended with veiled suggestions about my health and stability. Hints slipped into the conversation like pins hidden in wool, so thin and sharp you don't notice being pricked until the blood appears. She mentioned, casually, offhandedly, that she had spoken to my primary doctor just to check in, and the familiarity with which she said it made something cold slide down my spine, because I realized that she had been building this foundation for years, collecting scraps of information about my medical appointments, questioning my pharmacists under the guise of concern, painting a portrait of me as forgetful or confused in small, subtle strokes that no one would notice unless they had known. Me before the world shifted into this new, terrible shape. Then came the visit. She did not call first. She never calls when she wants control. She arrived mid-afternoon, a time she knew I would be home, and let herself in with the spare key I had forgotten she still possessed, a key I had once given her without hesitation when my hip surgery made stairs a challenge and she had insisted she could help. She walked in with the brisk confidence of someone entering a space she already considered her jurisdiction, her eyes scanning the living room as if assessing what would be easiest to pack first. She smiled, thin, tense, aloof, and said she was there to clear the air, but her gaze held none of the softness of reconciliation. Instead, it had the cool sharpness of someone preparing to negotiate an acquisition. She spoke in the careful cadence of a daughter performing concern for an audience, except there was no audience, only me. And yet she still delivered her monologue like a woman accustomed to applause. She insisted she had never intended to deceive anyone, that I had misunderstood the situation, that the woman at the notary's office was helping because I had been so overwhelmed lately. And when I asked her to explain what part of forging my signature and presenting falsified medical documents counted as helping, she winced, not from guilt, but from annoyance, like a manager dealing with a stubborn employee. When I told her I had filed an official report with the police, she froze for half a second, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the anger beneath, the entitlement, the disbelief that her own mother would dare put herself between my daughter and the object she desired. But then she adjusted, recalibrated, and said in a voice slick with condescension that she was only trying to protect me from complex decisions, that my house was too much responsibility, that I should consider transitioning to something smaller and safer, and the word safer curled in the air like a threat dressed up as tenderness. I asked her directly if she had hired the woman who pretended to be me, and she tilted her head with that infuriating expression she wears when she wants to make me feel unstable, the one she probably practiced in the mirror, and said, "Mom, you're remembering it wrong. No one, you've..." After she left, storming out, slamming the door only after she thought she was out of earshot, I walked through the house with my hand trailing along the wall for balance, but not because I was weak. I needed to feel the solidity of the place, its stubbornness, its physical truth, because my daughter had spent years trying to convince me I could not trust my own memory. I checked the locks, one by one, then found the old shoebox where my husband and I kept our emergency documents, and laid everything out on the dining table like artifacts of a life I now needed to defend. The deeds, the mortgage papers, the insurance policies, the wills, the handwritten notes we made during lean years when decisions were too big for our bank account, but too important to postpone. I realized then that this was not the first escalation. It was simply the first time I had looked closely enough to see that the escalation had been happening gradually, quietly, expertly, as my daughter took control of my doctor's appointments, suggested updating my emergency contacts to her number, encouraged me to let her store my documents so nothing gets lost, and dismissed my questions as signs of mental fatigue. I had always trusted her because trust is the soil most mothers grow their daughters in. I hadn't noticed that she had been planting something else entirely. That night I slept poorly, listening to every creak of the house as if decoding a language I had forgotten how to read. My daughter did not return in person, but her texts multiplied, growing tighter, colder, more insistent that I talk to her before things get out of hand. And although I didn't respond, each message left a residue on my skin, a reminder that she believed the situation was simply an argument between an aging mother and a stressed daughter, not a crime that had been prevented only by a stranger's attention to detail. By the fourth night, I knew that silence was no longer a refuge. It was being interpreted by her as an opening, an opportunity to step further into my life, to construct new narratives around my supposed incapacity. So the escalation continued, not with a knock on the door or a lawyer's letter, but with a subtle shift in how she addressed me, the sudden use of diminutives she had never used before. Mama, sweetheart, honey, spoken with counterfeit warmth, so transparent it made my teeth ache. She sent links to retirement communities with smiling seniors playing cards, left voicemails explaining how freeing it would be for me to simplify my life. And in each message, the subtext thickened. I was becoming an obstacle to her vision of order, a variable she wanted to eliminate for convenience, not care. I sat at the table listening to those messages with my hands folded, realizing with a clarity that hurt more than any shouted accusation that the daughter I thought I had raised was not the woman standing before me now. The woman she had become saw me not as her mother but as a possession, a piece of property that had outlived its usefulness, a stepping stone, a changeless reminder of obligations she no longer wished to honor. And somewhere in that slow, suffocating week, as her pressure tightened like a rope, I understood the most painful truth of all. She had not suddenly become this person. I had simply for years refused to see her clearly. I woke the next morning with that heavy, sleepless feeling that happens when your mind has been pacing all night, even if your body never left the bed. And as I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the faint pattern on the wallpaper, the realization settled over me that waiting for my daughter to come to her senses was nothing more than another form of surrender, a surrender I had performed so many times over the years that it had become muscle memory, like exhaling without thinking. So familiar I mistook it for peace. The house felt unusually still, as if it were holding its breath with me, and I found myself walking through each room, not with the soft nostalgia of a woman counting her blessings, but with the alertness of someone taking inventory before a storm. I touched the surfaces lightly, the dining table where we celebrated my husband's last birthday, the window ledge he sanded after he got splinters from it, the bookshelf where my daughter once lined up her dolls as if they were waiting for judgment, and in every ordinary object I sensed a quiet plea not to let the life we had built be rewritten by someone who believed she had the authority to rearrange my history to suit her needs. I had reached a point where the fear of confrontation was smaller than the fear of disappearing. And that reversal, that subtle shifting of weight inside me, became the force that nudged me toward the small wooden desk in the study where my husband used to pay bills. I pulled open the drawers, not frantically, but with the steady deliberation of a woman preparing to reclaim the ground beneath her. I found the old accordion folders stuffed with documents we hadn't touched in years, each paper slightly yellowed at the edges, but still intact, still real, still mine. I spread everything across the desk: deeds, tax records, insurance statements, correspondence with the bank, letters from the early years of our marriage when we were learning how to be two people building a single life, and I began to organize them, not for my daughter, not for any legal battle, but for myself, because I needed to remember the full story of how we built this house, step by painstaking step, so that I could stand firm in the knowledge that this place was not a gift to be taken back, but a lifetime carved into walls and floors and memories. As I turned pages and reread old signatures, something inside me untangled. I saw in my own handwriting the woman I had been before. Grief hollowed out the center of my life. Before age and loneliness made me too willing to hand over pieces of my autonomy in exchange for a little company or a fleeting moment of feeling needed. I remembered the arguments we won against banks that doubted us, the nights we cooked simple meals by candlelight because we were saving every dollar for the down payment, the afternoons we spent sanding the porch railing until our arms ached. This house was not an asset to be reassigned. It was the architecture of 40 years of devotion, and remembering that gave me a clarity I had not felt since the day my daughter married her husband and began looking at me as if I were the wall, separating her from the life she wanted. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, slid them into a new folder, and placed it in the center of the desk as if handing myself an assignment I was finally ready to complete. Then, almost without thinking, I called the notary, not to revisit the disaster of the previous week, but to ask him a question that had been echoing in my mind. What could I do, legally and immediately, to protect my home from being touched without my explicit consent? He spoke to me with a respect that felt rare, explaining in clear terms the steps I could take to place alerts on my property, to require in-person verification for any transfer, to request additional documentation that my daughter or anyone acting on her behalf could not replicate without exposing themselves to further criminal liability. He did not treat me like an elderly woman in distress. He treated me like a homeowner taking responsible action, and that small dignity lit something warm and steady inside me. After hanging up, I made myself tea, not from the dusty grocery store bags I usually settled for, but from the expensive tin my neighbor had given me 2 Christmases ago, the one I had deemed too nice to open and tucked into the back of the cupboard. I brewed it slowly, savoring the ritual, because for the first time in weeks, I was doing something that wasn't about reacting to my daughter's choices, but about choosing for myself. While I drank the tea, I wrote a list of people I needed to contact: an attorney recommended by the notary, the bank manager who had helped my husband refinance years ago, the insurance agent who still sent holiday cards with handwritten notes. Each name was a reminder that my world was larger than the circle my daughter tried to draw around me, a reminder that I had resources she had underestimated precisely because she didn't believe I would use them. By mid-afternoon, I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in months, a sense of direction I thought I had lost with age. And when my daughter texted again, this time with a more urgent tone, insisting we resolve this family issue before it escalates, I didn't feel the familiar tightening in my chest. Instead, I looked at her message the way you look at a billboard, advertising something you no longer need, with faint curiosity, but no desire. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence was no longer a retreat. It was a statement of boundary. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, I stepped out onto the porch with the folder of documents under my arm and sat in the chair my husband had repaired so many times that its joints were practically made of memories. I watched the neighborhood settle into its quiet rhythm, children being called inside, a dog barking 2 yards over, the hum of someone's kitchen vent, and felt a kind of gentle mourning for the years when I believed blindly that love alone would bind. My daughter to me with the same fierce loyalty I had given her. But mourning is not weakness. It is the acknowledgement of truth, and in that truth, I found a strength I didn't know remained in me. I sat there until the sky turned violet, thinking not of the betrayal itself, but of the long road that led to it, the years of small concessions, the compromises I made in the name of keeping peace, the way I convinced myself that her dismissiveness was stress, that her coldness was exhaustion, that her superiority was ambition rather than disdain. It occurred to me that the betrayal hadn't begun at the notary's office. It had begun years ago when she realized she could speak to me in clipped tones, and I would swallow the hurt, when she learned she could ask for money, and I would give it. Without question, when she saw that my gratitude for any scrap of attention made me tolerate things I would never have accepted from anyone else. Seeing that truth did not break me, it freed me. As darkness settled fully around the house, I rose from the porch with a decision that felt both inevitable and revolutionary. From this moment on, I would no longer wait for my daughter to rewrite the narrative into something palatable. I would not appease her. I would not negotiate my dignity, and I would not shrink myself into the frightened, compliant version of me she relied on. I would protect my home. I would protect my voice. And most importantly, I would protect the version of me that still believed in her own worth, the version my daughter had tried so quietly to erode. For the first time in a long while, I went to bed not as a woman bracing for what her child might do next, but as a woman preparing to reclaim her life inch by hard-won inch. It wasn't surprising, though still strangely stunning, how quickly the quiet returned after that brief flicker of clarity, as if the world around me wanted to pretend nothing had shifted, nothing had cracked, nothing had been exposed for the lie it truly was. But beneath that false calm, something had begun to move with its own slow, deliberate force. And although I didn't yet know the shape of it, I felt it spreading inside me, pushing me toward a place where silence was no longer safety, but suffocation. A few days passed without a knock on the door, without another uninvited entry, and I foolishly allowed myself to believe that perhaps my daughter had taken my stillness as a boundary she dared not cross. But such wishful thinking lasted only until the morning I stepped outside to water the hydrangeas and found an envelope tucked beneath the welcome mat, the one I had crocheted myself 30 years ago when my hands were steadier and my hope far larger. I recognized her handwriting instantly, clean, sharp, almost architectural in its precision, and for a long moment I debated leaving it untouched, letting the sun bleach it into obscurity. But something in me, the old part of a mother who still wants. To hear her child's voice, no matter how poisoned the message might be, forced my fingers to break the seal. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, written in the tone of someone performing remorse without ever surrendering control. She said she was deeply hurt by my accusations, that she had never intended for anything to spiral, that I had misinterpreted actions taken solely for my well-being, and that she felt I was pushing her away during a time when families should unite. Each sentence was a needle dipped in sugar, carefully placed to make me question my own memory, my own instincts, my own sense of betrayal. And then right in the middle, like the rotten pit inside a polished fruit, she wrote that if I continued to refuse collaborative planning, she would have no choice but to explore legal avenues to protect the family estate. Not my well-being, not my safety, not my stability, the family estate. My home reduced to an asset she believed she owned through moral entitlement rather than legal truth. I folded the letter once, twice, placed it back in the envelope, and felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle over me. Not fiery or dramatic, but cold and structured. The kind of steadiness that comes when you finally glimpsed the full outline of a person's intentions and realize there is no misunderstanding left to salvage. That was the first sign of the new escalation, not the loud one, not the one that comes with shouting or slammed doors, but the quiet one, the calculated one, the one that creeps under your skin through implication rather than action. The second sign came that afternoon when my phone buzzed with a call from the medical clinic, the same clinic I had been visiting for 2 decades. The nurse spoke hesitantly, explaining that my daughter had phoned them requesting access to my recent lab results and inquiring whether I had shown signs of cognitive decline. The nurse knew me well enough to feel uneasy repeating this, and she asked gently if everything at home was all right, if I needed someone to speak on my behalf. I told her the truth, though in a softened version, because I felt embarrassed. There is no humiliation quite like realizing your own child is trying to build a case for your incompetence without your consent. She apologized, said she would flag my file to prevent third-party access without strict verification. And even though her voice was kind, I felt a wave of heat rise up my neck. Not anger, not sorrow, but the sting of recognition that my daughter had been planting these seeds for far longer than I had dared to see. By evening, the pressure had grown into something unmistakable. My neighbor, an older man with a habit of noticing everything, even when it seems he isn't looking, knocked on my door to ask if I was moving. Confused, I asked what made him think that, and he explained that earlier in the day, a woman, who matched my daughter's description exactly, had stood outside with a clipboard, taking photos of my house from multiple angles, measuring distances, even lifting the edge of the fence gate as if inspecting the hinges. When he approached to ask if she needed help, she told him she was evaluating the property for future transition planning. He assumed, as many people do when they see a younger relative giving instructions with brisk authority, that she was helping me downsize. I thanked him, assured him I was not moving, and closed the door with such a slow, deliberate motion that it felt like lowering the curtain on a stage I no longer wished to perform on. That night the house felt different, not violated exactly, but observed, as if every wall carried the imprint of her ambitions pressing inward. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place she had once done her homework, while I tried to make dinners vibrant enough to distract her from how little we had. And I realized I had spent so many years believing I owed her a version of myself that was small, compliant, useful. I had made myself easy to override. I had made myself convenient to rearrange, and now she believed she was correcting a flaw in the architecture of her life by tightening the reins around mine. It would have been easier if she had stormed in shouting, if she had thrown accusations or unleashed an explosion of resentment, because then at least I could have met fire with fire. But the cruelty was colder, more deliberate, like a glacier pressing slowly against the foundations of my home. shifting the ground without making a sound. This became undeniable 2 days later when I received a visit from a man in a crisp suit who introduced himself as an estate advisor. He spoke politely, though with the precise cadence of someone trained to deliver difficult information in a tone that soothed rather than alarmed. He said my daughter had retained him to guide me through the transition process, and when I asked what transition he referred to, he said, in a lowered voice meant to signal empathy, that it was often hard for older adults to take the necessary steps before cognitive decline complicates matters. I stared at him long enough for discomfort to bloom across his face like a rash, and then I asked him if fabricating incompetence in one's own parent was a new trend in his line of work, or simply a service they offered to certain clients whose conscience didn't stretch as far as their sense of entitlement. He stammered something about misunderstanding, realized quickly he was in the wrong house this time, and excused himself with the flimsy dignity of a man who suddenly understood he had walked straight into a mother's rising storm. I locked the door behind him and leaned against it, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that the escalation had now become a campaign, quiet, insidious, strategic. My daughter wasn't merely upset or misguided. She was constructing a narrative in which I was no longer the rightful narrator of my own life. She was positioning herself as the guardian of my future, the arbiter of my capacities, the unquestioned heir to a legacy she had not earned. And underneath every calculated action was the unspoken belief that I was too old, too soft, too slow, too dependent to stop her. But escalation, when pushed far enough, births its opposite. Something in me hardened like cooling metal. I found myself moving through the house with a new intention, checking windows not out of fear, but out of vigilance, reviewing documents not out of frailty, but out of strategy. I contacted the attorney the notary had recommended, and he welcomed me into his office with the kind of respect that makes you aware of how much disrespect you had been swallowing. I explained everything, not dramatically, not accusingly, just plainly, as a woman presenting facts stripped clean of excuses. He listened without interrupting, then explained that what my daughter had done was not merely unethical, but criminal, that the attempt to impersonate me for a property transfer was a felony, that her efforts to access my medical information without consent constituted violations, and that any further attempts to interfere with my autonomy could be legally contested through protective orders designed not for physical safety, but for preservation of independent decision-making. It was strange to hear the law articulated in service of my dignity, as if the system itself recognized a value in me that my own daughter had denied. Leaving his office, I felt taller, not physically. My bones were still old, and my joints still resentful, but internally, spiritually, the way a person grows when they finally stop bending. Yet the escalation continued, pressing against the walls of my new resolve. My daughter left more messages, some angry, some pleading, some dripping with that saccharine sweetness she weaponized when she wanted to guilt me into surrender, insisting that shutting her out was dangerous behavior, that relying on biased strangers would only make things worse, that I needed to let her handle things before they reached a point of no return. She didn't realize that we had already crossed that point, not because of the notary or the attempted fraud, but because for the first time in months, perhaps years, I had begun to see myself not as someone lucky to have her, but as someone who deserved more than the contempt she disguised as leadership. One evening, shortly before the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I saw her car parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted. She sat inside but did not get out. She watched the house with an intensity that sent a tremor through the hedge by the walkway. And although she stayed only 10 minutes, the message was unmistakable. She was recalculating her strategy, searching for my weaknesses, waiting for the moment she believed I would falter. But she no longer recognized me. She expected the mother she had molded, not the woman I had reawakened. Inside the house, I closed every curtain slowly, deliberately, not out of fear, but out of reclamation. I moved through the rooms, touching the walls, with the careful reverence of a person feeling the edges of a new territory. And as the house grew darker, I realized I was no longer trying to stop her from taking my home. I was preparing to defend my life from being rewritten, one falsified narrative at a time. And in that growing darkness, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not despair, not rage, but resolve, the heavy, quiet kind that settles into the bones like iron and refuses to be shaken loose by the hands of anyone who believes they have the right to rearrange the life of the woman who birthed them. I did not know the precise moment when resolve hardened into action, only that one morning I woke with an unfamiliar steadiness, the kind that comes not from courage, but from exhaustion, from realizing that the only thing more dangerous than standing up was continuing to kneel. The house felt unnaturally quiet, as if waiting for me to make a decision it had long expected. And when I stepped onto the porch, the cool air carried the faint scent of citrus from the neighbor's tree, a smell that usually softened me. But this time, it only sharpened the awareness that my daughter believed I was too gentle, too sentimental, too tethered to the past to take any step she might consider an act of defiance. I stood there for a long minute, gripping the railing, and the wood beneath my palm seemed almost to pulse with memories. My husband sanding it for the 5th time, my daughter leaning against it as a teenager while complaining about curfews, my own, hands painting it year after year to keep it alive. And something inside whispered that this house had held me up through storms greater than what my daughter now represented, and it would hold me up again. I went inside and gathered the documents I had organized in the study, placing them into a thick folder that felt heavier than its paper contents justified, because it carried not just signatures and dates, but decades of choices, sacrifices, and vows that no one, not even my daughter, had the right to repurpose for their own convenience. I also tucked into my handbag a small photograph of my husband and me, taken the day we received the keys to this very house, both of us smiling with the naive certainty of people who believed hard work could protect them from anything. I was not taking it for sentimentality. I was taking it as a reminder that I owed that younger version of myself the dignity of finishing the fight she had once started with such optimism. At the attorney's office, the receptionist greeted me with professional warmth, but when I told her why I had come, something in her posture shifted with that subtle mixture of sympathy and admiration reserved for people who arrive at a crossroads. Fully aware that the path ahead may not offer comfort, but will at least offer truth. The attorney ushered me inside, and I handed him the folder without trembling. He opened it, scanned the papers, and nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. He explained in measured detail the options available to me: filing formal affidavits, placing legal restrictions that would prevent any transaction relating to the house without my verified physical presence, initiating a report that documented the attempted impersonation and my daughter's escalating behavior, and, if I chose, pursuing charges that could result in a court order limiting her authority over any aspect of my life. Each option was a thread that, once pulled, could unravel the false narrative she had been weaving around me for months, maybe even years. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I asked him the question I had been carrying like a stone: whether filing those protections would officially state that my daughter had acted with malice. He looked at me with unexpected gentleness and said that the law did not care about the emotional vocabulary of families, only the actions taken, and that her actions met every threshold of intent required to justify intervention. Hearing it spoken aloud by someone outside my world, someone who had nothing to gain from softening the truth, cut deeper than any argument she and I had ever had. But it also brought with it a strange kind of relief, like finally seeing the full outline of a shadow that had been growing behind me for years. He asked if I wished to proceed, and for a moment I saw my daughter as she had once been, small, feverish, curled against my chest, then later triumphant at her graduation, then overwhelmed after the birth of her first child, and then slowly, gradually, unrecognizably changing into someone who believed control was love and domination was responsibility. And I understood, with a clarity that hurt but did not break me, that loving her did not require surrendering myself. So I said yes, not loudly, not defiantly, but with the quiet conviction of a woman who has finally chosen herself. The attorney prepared the documents, explaining each step carefully. I signed them one by one, my hand steady, my breath slow. With each signature, I felt something loosen inside me, not joy, not even victory, but a shedding, like removing a cloak I should never have worn. When it was done, he handed me copies of the filings along with written confirmation of the restrictions placed on my property, and the paper felt warm from the printer, as if the ink had not yet fully dried on the truth I had just declared. As I walked out of the office, the sunlight hitting the pavement felt strangely new. I held my bag tightly, not out of fear of losing the documents, but out of awareness that this was the moment everything in my life had pivoted. I was no longer a spectator in my own story. I was, once again, its author. I had almost reached my car when I heard my name spoken in the unmistakable tone of a person who believes they still have power over you. I turned, and there she was, my daughter, striding across the parking lot with a mixture of outrage and disbelief carved into her expression. I did not need to ask how she knew where I was. She had always been adept at tracking me, inserting herself into my decisions, appearing at precisely the moment she believed she could redirect the narrative. She demanded to know why I was avoiding her, why I was acting irrationally, why I had involved strangers in our private matters. Her voice rose with each accusation, sharp and frantic, not because she feared losing me, but because she feared losing access to what she considered hers. I let her speak. For once, I did not rush to calm her, soothe her, diffuse her anger. I simply stood there, letting every word fall to the ground without absorbing it. When she finally paused for breath, I told her, in a voice so steady it startled even me, that I had taken legal steps to protect my home, my autonomy, and my future. I told her that any further attempt to interfere with my medical records, my property, or my decisions would be handled not through family conversations, but through formal channels. And I told her, with a calmness sharper than any weapon, that trust once broken in that manner could no longer be repaired by explanations polished into excuses. Her face shifted from anger to confusion, to something like fear, the fear of a person who has miscalculated the depth of the well they thought they owned. She insisted I was overreacting, that she was only trying to look after me, that everything she did was rooted in responsibility. I shook my head slowly and told her, responsibility does not hide in parking lots. Responsibility does not forge signatures. Responsibility does not hire strangers to impersonate a living mother. Responsibility does not build a narrative of incompetence for convenience. I told her she would not rewrite the truth this time. Her voice cracked just once, and she asked if I was choosing a house over my own child. It was a familiar trap, an old emotional snare I had stepped into countless times, but not this time. I told her I was choosing myself. I was choosing the life I had built with my husband, the dignity I still possessed, the history written into every corner of my home. I was choosing the version of me she had tried to disappear. She left, not with the triumphant stride she had arrived with, but with the uneven steps of someone discovering that the person they underestimated has grown teeth. And as I watched her drive away, I felt a quietness settle over me that was not emptiness, but completion, the sense that something long overdue had finally, irrevocably shifted. I got into my car, placed the folder gently on the seat beside me, and realized I was not afraid. Not of her, not of solitude, not of age, not of the consequences of choosing myself. I drove home slowly, the sun lowering behind me, and when I pulled into the driveway, the house greeted me not as a possession to be defended, but as an ally, a witness, a sanctuary that had waited patiently for me to reclaim it. And for the first time in a very long time, I crossed the threshold, not as someone trying to hold on, but as someone who had already won. The days that followed unfolded in a slow, steady hush, as if the air itself had softened around me, no longer thick with the tension that had crept through every shadow of my house in the weeks before. I moved through my rooms with a different posture, not taller exactly, but more rooted, like a tree that has discovered the true depth of its own roots after surviving a storm it never wanted, but somehow outlasted. I expected the fear to linger, expected the tremor of uncertainty to trail behind me in the hallways, yet instead there was an unfamiliar lightness, a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. I began to open my curtains again, not as an act of invitation, but as an act of ownership, letting the sun wash across the floors and walls that had witnessed my undoing and my reassembling. My daughter's silence stretched longer than I anticipated, and though I would never admit it aloud, part of me feared her absence more than her interference, because absence carries its own sharpness, a reminder that what was once love had calcified into something brittle. But this silence was different. It did not feel like abandonment or intimidation. It felt like retreat. She had struck her final note and realized at last that I was not an echo chamber for her demands, that I would no longer bend myself into shapes convenient for her ambitions. She must have assumed I would crumble under the weight of conflict, that age would make me pliable, that guilt would soften my steps. Instead, she met a woman she had forgotten existed, a woman who once built a life with bare hands and stubborn will, a woman who now refused to be erased. I spent long afternoons on the porch, not watching for her return, but watching the world return to itself. The neighbor's dog stretched in the sun, the mailman waved with that familiar half-smile, the camellia bud swelled pink against the fence, and with every small, ordinary thing, I felt the house stitching itself back into me, thread by quiet thread. I found myself speaking out loud sometimes, not to anyone in particular, but to the air, to my husband's memory, to the lingering ache of all the years spent giving more than I received. I told him I hoped he understood that protecting our home had not been an act of defiance, but an act of devotion, a way of honoring the life we crafted with so much fervent intention. There was a moment, one evening, as the sun dipped low and the first cicadas hummed against the trees, when I felt a pang so sharp I had to sit down. It wasn't regret exactly. It was the sorrow of understanding that some stories don't mend, no matter how much love is poured into their broken edges. I thought of my daughter as a child, the softness of her hand curled around my finger, the weight of her trust resting unguarded on my chest, and I wondered when the thread had snapped, when her love had mutated into entitlement, when my generosity had been mistaken for permission. The ache didn't linger long. It drifted through me the way grief does once it has accepted its own boundaries, settling not as a wound, but as a quiet truth. Eventually the phone rang again, not my daughter, but the notary. He wanted to inform me that all the flags and protections were in place, that the incident had been logged thoroughly, that no one would be able to touch my property without my unmistakable presence. His voice held a kind of gentle respect that made my eyes sting, not from sadness, but from the recognition that there were still people in this world who saw me clearly, who did not require me to justify my existence. After the call, I sat for a long while at the kitchen table, the evening light falling across the surface in thin golden stripes, and I felt a quiet contentment I had not known since before the whole ordeal began. Not happiness. Happiness is too fragile a word for a woman my age, but a steady, abiding peace. The final closure came unexpectedly in the form of a small, almost timid envelope delivered by the postman. There was no return address, but I recognized her handwriting immediately. The letter inside was short, disjointed, the phrasing circled with hesitation. She wrote that she needed time, that she understood things had gone too far, that she never intended the outcome that unfolded. She did not apologize. She did not claim responsibility. She simply retreated behind the curtain of her own discomfort, unable or unwilling to step fully into accountability. I read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer, not as evidence, not as a wound. Simply as a final page in a chapter I no longer needed to revisit. That night, as the cool breeze drifted through the open window and the house settled into its nighttime rhythm, I whispered something I had not said aloud in years, not to my daughter, not to the past, but to myself. I said, "You stayed." It was not a declaration of survival, but of presence, of choosing to exist fully, even when others tried to shrink you into a shadow. And as I lay there, listening to the soft creaks of the home that had sheltered every version of me, I felt a grounded certainty settle into my bones. I had reclaimed my life, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through the simple, unwavering insistence that I was still here. And for any woman who might one day find herself standing where I stood, unsure, overlooked, slowly disappearing beneath the ambitions of those she once held close, I would say this: you are never too old to choose yourself. You are never too small to protect what is yours. You are never invisible to the truth of your own worth. You can walk back into your life at any moment, lay your hand on your own history, and say firmly and without apology, "This is mine.